Thank you for that kind introduction. I hope I'm audible now, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to this wonderful organization. I've really been enjoying my visit. Today I'm going to talk about a movement that's often called transhumanism, posthumanism, that's diffuse, that doesn't really have a center, that has a lot of variations, and yet that's been very influential, I'm going to suggest, that is no longer marginal, but that includes some of the most prominent organizations in government and industry and nonprofits. And I'm going to be talking about the goal of transcendence, of preserving the mind and the body through the use of advanced technology, achieving a kind of digital immortality. And as a historian, I'm always interested in where ideas originate. David Noble has written an excellent book on the religion of technology, the theology of technology, and he mentions there one book in 1969 that I think might be considered the origin of all of this, J.D. Bernal's The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. And Bernal was a Marxist and an atheist, but he was somebody with a deep spirituality of a certain kind. And he felt these three enemies of the rational soul, he felt, were nature, the body, and human desires and emotions. And so one of the ways that he thought to combat these enemies was to remove the brain from the body and artificially maintain its function by mechanical means. Sooner or later, man will be forced to decide whether to abandon his body or his life. After all, it is the brain that counts, he wrote. And he also thought of disembodied brains that would transform men, transcending the capacities of untransformed humanity. Freed from the ravages of age and the flesh, for bodies at this time would be left far behind, they would become virtually immortal, experiencing a, quote, continuity of consciousness in a practical eternity of existence. Normal man is at an evolutionary dead end, declared Bernal. Mechanical man, apparently a break in organic evolution, is actually more in the true tradition of a future evolution, and so forth. This was in 1969, really before the internet, before any real speculation about how that would happen. And today, we're really coming to a point where these possibilities seem closer than they ever did. I'm not arguing how close they really are, but I'd like to explore this afternoon how forces are converging, how technology and cultural forces are coming together to explore certain human possibilities, and the possibility of living forever in the cloud, having your virtual existence continue, perhaps to be reunited with the body, perhaps independent of the body. And I'll be concluding with some thoughts about what the best strategy really is for achieving at least immortality of reputation. So I could start with whether cloud computing and bioengineering really are reaching a tipping point. Here you have this idea of the cloud, a kind of disembodied world of pure ideas, of pure images. But the reality, of course, is in this partial scene of a Google server of mass and energy in order to make this cloud exist. Now, storage and processing is now almost too cheap to meter. This has been a real revolution in the last few years. The existence of a medium like Facebook really depends on storage that doesn't need subscription fees, that storage that can continue. And now the default really is to preserve the memory of the person. That is, you're going to persist on Facebook until somehow you're removed. It isn't as though there is a fee to pay and you'll be canceled if you don't. And so there are services now described in this. There are volunteer efforts of people's friends to preserve their websites, to preserve their blog posts, and to preserve their memory. And this is one kind of the immortality that we'll be talking about, and we'll be especially paying attention to a 34-year-old man who died at 34 of cardiac arrhythmia named Mark Tanis, whose memory is now being preserved in that way. In Wired magazine, Scott Brown reviewed more active services for continuing personality. Why continue to live in this way, a mere shadow of one's former self, he writes, because maybe it's more than a shadow. Maybe it's enough of a self to be worthy of life support, and I'll take some semblance of life over none at all. A further indication was a recent PBS Nova production on the biology of life extension and the prospects for deferring death indefinitely. And what's most interesting, since a lot of people would say, well, this can all be explained by the anxieties of aging baby boomers, that the Princeton Student Science and Society magazine has now featured Cryonic Suspension as a front page article of its latest issue. So these things have cultural resonance now that really goes beyond a small number of enthusiasts that's penetrating into everyday discourse. You may have read about Watson, the IBM computer that can beat human champions at Jeopardy, and that's now going to be going into a match on St. Valentine's Day that IBM hopes will duplicate the success of its computer against a chess champion. So this shows that computers are now beginning to edge into territory that however the underlying programming works, seems to be a kind of uncanny duplication of human thinking. And there is a project in Switzerland that actually is mapping the structure of the mammalian brain in a way that might permit the construction of a virtual electronic mind. This is the homepage of the project. As you'll see, the first comprehensive attempt to reverse engineer the mammalian brain in order to understand brain function and dysfunction through detailed simulations. Right now, they're working just with thin sections of rat brain, but eventually they're hoping to scale that up to humanity. So these are then not marginal products of some enthusiasts, but are supported by some of the largest hardware and software companies. And they're even penetrating the popular consciousness in the form of a simplest style of immortality on the web, memorialization. There's a service in New Jersey run by a woman named Carrie Glass that helps dying people sort out their most precious possessions and memories and produce a DVD for their families. Here are some views of the process and of Ms. Glass, and you can see how there's an editing screen where that is now in process. So the family will have a DVD, but it's not unreasonable to think that they will be able to post it on the web free because storage is so cheap. So people in that way could have a certain kind of immortality that might last indefinitely. There's another style of immortality, though, that could be called avatarization. And this involves the construction of a virtual model of a person, their facial features, their mannerisms that might actually answer questions for us and in some way participate in a kind of two-way dialogue, but not a complete one. The key person for this is a man named William Sims Bainbridge. He is, again, by no means a marginal person. He's a senior program officer at the National Science Foundation, a very respected sociologist of religion. I reviewed his excellent book, Satan's Power, which is an ethnography of a Scientology offshoot. It's a very sophisticated view of how people can actually use an ostensibly satanic theology in a constructive way in their lives. So he is really a very prominent Harvard PhD. And he also is somebody who knows something about conventional memorialization. On his website, he has the biographies of some of his distinguished ancestors. It's a very prominent military, scientific, and medical family. The Bainbridge Island, one of the most desirable places to live in the United States, according to various polls near Seattle, was actually named for an illustrious ancestor of his in the War of 1812. But apart from his work sponsoring advanced projects in nanotechnology and related fields, he has a personal site that is devoted to advanced and spiritual goals through technology. I can't go through all of his projects, but one of them that's especially interesting is the one in the middle, the personality capture tool. Self is a software tool for exploring the image you have of yourself, a microscope for the mind. It helps you follow the ancient maxim, know thyself, and it provides a record of your values, habits, interactive style, and personality. So this could be the basis of an avatar. It isn't avatar software as such, but it can be a source for constructing one in the future when avatars become more advanced. And this leads, of course, to the people who now are working on real-time interactive avatars, the next stage of avatarization. And this is Jason Lee of the University of Illinois at Chicago, who is featured on Nova and who is developing systems for it, and there is a picture of his own avatar. Here is a paper that he and his colleagues have written. This is one of the people who has been transformed into an avatar. This is the other Schwarzkopf. This is Dr. Alex Schwarzkopf, another prominent NSF program officer, now retired, and you can see how he's been very realistically mapped as an avatar. And there's something sort of uncanny about the way in which the person sort of dissolves into the wireframe representation of himself. Now, I'm going to show you one of the representations of how an avatar works in the electronic visualization lab. Is the center button the clicker for enter, like for starting an animation? I'm looking for whatever does that, like an enter key or something, maybe.
I'm not sure.
I'm sorry?
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, let me see if an enter key will work. Oops, nope, that doesn't. I hadn't. I tried it on my.
There's an arrow down there. Can you point at that?
I don't think. I'm not sure the arrow works, but when you, you can find it on the web. There was a wonderful animation of a face that was. Let me see if it. I click. Wait. It's like a double clicking. I can double. Okay. I can. Let me double click. That's it. Go to the. It should launch. I'm sorry. It launched on my machine at home, so I apologize. But you can see this animation on their website. And the third step, though, is achieving two-way immortality through mind uploading. This is the real thing. This is the real goal of immortality on the web. And the pioneer of that goal is a man that is really legendary in computer circles, Gordon Bell, who is sometimes called the Frank Lloyd Wright of computing. He was a very important person in network computing and at the early stages of the web. And here he is at a meeting, and you can see he's holding a device called the SenseCam. The SenseCam is a recording camera that detects the presence of a person. So it detects a conversation, and you don't have to turn it on. It automatically records every conversation that you have. And he and other Microsoft people have become enthusiasts of this program. He has written a book, co-authored a Microsoft report on the theme of digital immortality, and says there it's a continuing from enduring fame on one end to endless experience and learning on the other, stopping just short of endless life. Endless experience and learning is two-way immortality, allowing you, or at least part of you, to communicate with the future in the sense that artifact continues to learn and evolve. Current technology can extend corporeal life for a few decades. Both one-way and two-way immortality require part of a person to be converted to information, cyberized, and stored in a more durable media. We believe that two-way immortality, where one's experiences are digitally preserved and which then take on a life of their own, will be possible within this century. And this is, by the way, a schematic of all of the elements that go into their program, which is just available for Microsoft employees now, called My Life Bits. And this is a screen from My Life Bits showing how the elements come together. By the way, I was in a meeting with some Microsoft executives, and they were logging the meeting with their computers, and one of them showed me some of the saved material that he had on My Life Bit. So this is again something that's gone beyond a few researchers and is being embraced by a lot of mainstream computer people. This is Ray Kurzweil, who is receiving the National Medal of Technology from President Clinton, and Kurzweil is really probably the most active, the most prominent, and controversial of the advocates of virtual immortality on the web, as well as we'll see, of physical immortality. And he has declared here in an article in the Independent in 2009 that unlike Gordon Bell, he thinks that this will be coming by 2040, that you'll be able to upload your brain to the cloud. And he is the founder of the Singularity University, which is supported by Autodesk, Google, and other leading technology companies and foundations, and that offers courses in what to do when this new utopia comes and how to hasten it. And it is very popular in a lot of corporate circles. So this is really a gathering force as a movement. And on the other hand, it has some quite a few skeptics, and among them are neuroscientists. The interesting thing about virtual immortality is that the people who are most skeptical about uploading the brain to the web are the people who actually study the brain, very few of whom are actually involved in the movement. And one of the people who is actually on the more advanced side of research and more optimistic about the possibilities, Christoph Koch, is pretty pessimistic that the neural code will be very easy to detect, that it's very dynamic, it's constantly changing, the brain is always evolving, there may be no universal principle above and beyond the insight that brains are amazingly adaptive and can extract every bit of information possible, inventing new codes as necessary. So if this is really the way the brain works, then it would seem that there would be no way that we can conceive of to replicate it in silicon. There is one prominent neuroscientist who has at least in principle endorsed it, but I have not been able to reach him, so I can't cite any person on the other side. On the humanist side, also, N. Catherine Hales has reminded us of the importance of a material substrate for virtual thought. Now, at this point, we come to the relationship between the body and the brain, and there again, neuroscientists have been finding some information that makes Dr. Bernal's observations pretty questionable. and especially the part that the emotion and the relationship between the rest of the body and the brain are essential to establishing and maintaining human consciousess. Dr. Damasio is only one of the people who have studied this, and even the Wall Street Journal now is publishing an article on the brain and the stomach, and pointing out that this brain has as many neural cells as a cat's brain. So we have a much more sophisticated and complex knowledge now of the relationship between the body and the brain, and that doesn't rule out immortalization in the web, but that means we have this additional task of building a virtual body that will interact in some kind of simulation or emulation of the relationship of our stomach and the rest of our body to the brain. Now, at this point, if we really need a body for the brain to function, there's the question of whether we can live forever, preserve, or revive the body. And this has been one of the fastest, it's been one of the areas of thinking that has been really revived most dramatically recently. There are popular books about this. There are many formulas written for how to do it. Partly because we have discovered a number of the mechanisms of senescence. Aubrey de Grey is an English computer scientist who became a gerontologist, and he claims that each one of the mechanisms of senescence can be isolated and combated with pharmaceuticals and with genetic modification that will permit us to shut down each of these. And although scientists are skeptical, nobody has really managed to show that this is totally impossible. It is possible in principle, and you can see that there are really two degrees. There's a more gemütlich one, and then there is the prophetic one. And there are both of these tendencies in the transhumanist movement. Ray Kurzweil himself, though, was the main ambassador, partly because of family circumstances. His father died at a young age from a disease that Kurzweil believes could have been cured if he had lived longer. And Kurzweil is very conscious of his own mortality and has been working with his physician, Dr. Terry Grossman, on a program of exercise and diet and medication to arrest his own aging until the time comes when the kind of work that Aubrey de Grey is doing will at last make it possible to end the aging process. This is not the latest installation of Damien Hirst. This is the daily regimen of pills that Kurzweil is taking as prescribed by his doctor. So you can see that it's really a heroic effort to live a long time, and I think a "don't try this at home" disclaimer should be added at this point. And finally, something that you definitely should not try at home is cryonic preservation. This is a whole body chamber at the Alcor Life Extension Foundation. This is technically considered a cemetery for legal purposes, but the hope is that the bodies that have been suspended in special chemicals at low temperatures, they are very careful not to call it freezing, that these bodies will someday be revivable and that any damage will be reversible. But if you look closely at the fine print in their website, it's pretty clear that the first attempts at least will not be pretty. So you really have to wonder about this. Besides which, you really to do it right, you need somebody right there at your bedside to take over when you're flatlining. So it's not a terribly practical thing, but as you saw in the Princeton's case, it's still a fascinating one. So what is the, excuse me, so this union of the preserved soul and the resurrected body suggests to me a really ancient religious line of thought that is strikingly similar, and that is the idea of the soul in resurrection in ancient Egypt, which is, of course, a specialty of this very house that I'm speaking in. This is an image of one of the components of the soul, the ba, the mobile soul that flies around after death with the mummy. And if things were done right, and the ancient Egyptians were really very scientific, they had a Book of the Dead that was a detailed instruction manual for how to deal with all of the frightening things that are going to happen in the afterlife. It was included in countless burials. That's why so many of these are available. And if you follow this procedure, you could expect a very happy afterlife where you'd be continuing to do the same kinds of things that you were doing in this life. So there really wasn't anything terribly gloomy about the Egyptian sense of death. To the contrary, it was a sense of assurance that everything was going to go on, at least if you were of the economic bracket that would be able to pay for this. And one of the interesting things about Egypt, by the way, is the way in which these funerary practices became more and more democratic, spreading from the pharaohs to the aristocracy and then to many people that today might be considered middle class. This is a picture of the key ceremony. This is a ceremony called the opening of the mouth, and the idea is that after your soul has gone through these trials, it is reunited with the mummified body with gestures that were really like what a sculptor would do, and that thereafter you would be a kind of new and complete being like those that the transhumanists believe will be achieved in the future, and your soul could continue to circulate between this world and the next. So this was a tremendously influential idea. I think it's been echoed in many Jewish and Christian teachings, and it's probably reflected, for example, in ideas of physical resurrection for the Last Judgment in Judaism and Christianity, except that the order of the judgment is different from the one that appeared in ancient Egypt. This trend actually had a second renaissance in the mystical Russian thinking of the late 19th century. And we see here a great religious thinker named Fiodorov, who was an Eastern Orthodox mystic, Nikolai Fiodorov, and he had an idea for humanity of a great project. And the great project, this was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the great project was the revival of everybody who had ever lived on Earth, the reconstitution of their bodies, and the transportation of their bodies into space to colonize the universe. He was a revered figure in Russia, so much so that there have been some scholars of Russian culture and history, for example, the literary critic Boris Groys, and others who really see a lot of subsequent history as attempts to put this into action. And one of his disciples was the great blind Russian rocket scientist Tsiolkovsky, who is still revered in Russia. Here's a monument, and Tsiolkovsky also was motivated partly by this hope of the great work, the hope of a new bond between the present generation and its ancestors and the emergence of humanity into space. On the other hand, there are many contemporary Christians who are very concerned about this new style of immortalization. This is the magazine of evangelical Christianity, Christianity Today, very thoughtful magazine, and this is their cover story. And you can see that they're not terribly happy that many Christians are also thinking about prolonging their lives. After all, they can do more good on earth if they're still here. Heaven can wait. And besides which, there is an old religious tradition of humanity as co-creator of the universe along with God. It's present in Judaism. It's present in many branches of Christianity. So there are precedents for it, and yet the editors of the magazine really are taking care to remind the flock that this is not the eternal life that Jesus was talking about. This is a distraction. On the other hand, the author of this article says, well, if people are trying caloric restriction, if they're fasting to live longer, then maybe the fasting as a religious practice will make them bring them closer to God. So they're not entirely negative about the trend, but they are bemused by it. And one church has had a surprising pocket of interest, not that surprising considering their theology, the Latter-day Saints Church. There is an organization of Mormon Transhumanists on the web. And these thinkers believe that the Mormon idea of continued human progress in the afterlife, continuing the work of the faith in the afterlife, continuing to evangelize in the afterlife, that humanity can become godlike, which is a major theme of Mormon thought, that this is really very well supported by the transhumanist movement, and so these Mormons would like to join in the movement and bring religious and ethical concerns to the movement's goals. So there are definite pockets of religious support for the prospect of virtual immortality. Now, at this point, I've tried to be non-judgmental, but at this point there are some caveats, and that is that this image of Platonic stability, the image that kind of once you're up there, you're kind of drifting along and everything is fine, that isn't really the whole story. For one thing, human cloning, for example, was once a very promising idea for another kind of immortality. Perhaps you could store your genetic material, and then in the future you could be cloned and reunited with your brain. Well, it turned out that Dolly had a shortened lifespan, and all the current techniques known of cloning do change the DNA. They do seem to have deleterious health effects. So right now, although there are still cloning enthusiasts, the movement has lost a lot of the fervor that it did have because of this decay in the transmission of genetic information through cloning. There is also the fact that the people at Alcor, for example, really acknowledge that they don't have any way right now to prevent irreversible damage, even with their most careful protocols for the storage of the physical brain. So it's very hard to see now how your virtual brain could really be restored to a physical brain. And on William Bainbridge's own website, there are already 404 errors and links. And that is one of the problems of everything that's encoded in hypertext, that there is a high rate of decay of the links, and so these documents, unless somebody is meticulously maintaining and archiving them, are going to lose a lot of their value. And Bainbridge himself has said you can hear an authentic performance of Claudio Monteverdi's L'Orfeo opera from 1607, but you can't go to the Matrix online. It's gone. So the people are aware, even the supporters of the movement, that the web can be a surprisingly evanescent place. Now, there's another way to look at virtual immortality, though, and that is to look on the social side of it, to see it less as something technological than as the efforts of families and friends and groups and of people who have taken the time to organize them. And the most notorious case probably of the 20th century was Lenin and his efforts, the efforts of Soviet communists to preserve their leader are one of the main subjects of a wonderful new book that I've been reviewing in advance proof, the Immortalization Commission, that will be published in April, and it's really a wonderful read, a very passionate, philosophical and historical book full of verve that I know is going to be discussed a great deal. And Lenin, as he reveals there and as other researchers have revealed, really has, despite the initial hopes that he could be revived, he has become more or less a waxwork figure as more and more of him has had to be replaced over the years. And so there is the social side that the present present Russian regime, despite its Soviet antecedents, is leaning toward a standard interment for Lenin's remains and for not maintaining this very laborious process. But at the time it was built, this cubic Lenin Mausoleum was supposed to be in the vanguard of Russian thought, and good communists were encouraged to have a cube placed prominently in their homes as a reminder of their leader and the possibility of his returning. So in this case, it was really the end of communism that deprived both the virtual and the physical immortality of its likelihood. L. Ron Hubbard is another person who was very much fixated on digital immortality. In fact, Hubbard's followers believe that after his death, his mind migrated to another planet. So his mortal remains were cremated, but his mind is still out there. They feel his mind is still guiding them, and this is an aerial shot of one of the repositories of not of his remains, but of his intellectual legacy that has been engraved with rare metals and stored in special vaults. And there are signposts. You can see there are signposts. How do I get this back up? Clearly the extraterrestrials have been. I thought I was pressing the laser, but I. Yeah. Okay. So I won't try to. But you can see that in the center toward the top there are these the signs that the extraterrestrials will recognize and know that this is the place to partake of the sacred writings. Scientology, though, can maintain these because it is still a very prosperous or apparently prosperous movement. It continues to have a lot of very enthusiastic supporters as well as detractors, and they are also able to issue and reissue Ron Hubbard's book, so he is probably the most prolific deceased author in history. But ultimately, the fate of new religious movements is not so good. It is very hard for them to last more than a few decades or a century at most. One of the more interesting ones 100 years ago was the Khorasan Unity, who believed that the earth is hollow and that what we see in the skies is really at the center of the universe. This lasted quite a few years in Florida. It's now a Florida state park with an interesting website. But this is really what happens to the movement. Sooner or later, the generation after generation, they lose their following, and they're dissolved and remain only as curiosities. This, by the way, is a picture of computer scientists who have the keys to the various computer formats and physical formats that they are depositing in the Swiss Fort Knox, which is a former military bunker that is now used for ultra-high security storage of critical servers and other documents like this. So they are trying to immortalize the information that we have now, and yet it's hard to ignore that these too are going to be subject to decay. It's very unclear how much people will be able to revive with materials like this, although it's certainly a good try. And so there's that question of perpetual care. There's the question, just as in physical cemeteries, it's not clear that you're always going to be keeping up, who's going to keep up the place even though you've paid for so-called perpetual care. There's also the same question in cyberspace. And as Professor English mentioned, the prospect of global warming also means that the energy needed to sustain these server farms, which are helping to fuel global warming, that it's really not so sure that cyber society as we know it will still exist to support that virtual life. Now, there is another kind of immortality, though, of reputation, not really two-way immortality, but still a very striking case, and that is the Dukes of Kong, the Kong family, who are the descendants of Confucius, and they're the longest known documented lineage in the world. This is their ancestor. And this family was ennobled about 2,000 years ago by the emperors of China, who continued to shower support on their cult. This is, I believe, their temple in the hometown of Confucius, where sacrifices have been revived. So Confucianism is also a state-recognized religion in China today. And the family tree has now been recompiled. Many of the records had been lost, but there was a massive project to do this, and they now exist in an 80-volume publication, which will now be available on the web too. So Confucius, by virtue not only of this family continuity, but also of the continued influence in Chinese society, really has achieved the sort of immortality that people have been talking about. But it really helped a lot to have that family as a way of mobilizing the resources for immortality. And there is also the paradox that sometimes, if you want to be immortal, it pays to die young. This is from an article on the reputations of artists in a sociology journal. While those who enjoy a long life have more time in which to achieve renown, others on the verge of a promising career or struck down in the prime of life in a tragic accident, as a suicide as a result of incurable disease, as a wartime casualty, may be better remembered than they might have been had they lived out their lives. And one of the key cases, of course, is King Tutankhamun himself, who is also memorialized in a highly idealized version of his actual face, according to studies of the mummy. And my favorite, though, is Harry Elkins Widener. And anybody who has studied at Harvard, or many people who have visited Harvard, know that the center of the humanities at Harvard is the Harry Elkins Widener Library. And if we go up the steps of the library, we come to the entrance of the center of it, the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Room. Harry Elkins Widener was the son of two very wealthy Philadelphia families who died on the Titanic, it is said, because instead of getting into the lifeboat, he went back to his stateroom to reserve a rare book that he had bought in England. And he was not rescued, and his grief-stricken mother endowed the library as a memorial to him. And this is the library. This is his library. It isn't really a reconstruction. It houses his books, but does so in an exceptionally magnificent way with Baroque carvings that would be worthy of the court of Louis XIV, and this is still one of the first things that everybody sees when they go to the Harvard Reading Room, and as you can see in the lower left-hand corner, it is also very prominent on the Harvard website. So in that sense, the book collector Harry Elkins Widener is very much alive, and his tastes are alive. This was really the closest thing to a chosen profession that he had. So as a result of going down young on the Titanic, he really does have something like the kind of afterlife that we've been talking about. Oops, sorry. So I can't get back to that last to the last slide. But it was just a repetition of this one. So what do we conclude from this trip that we've been on and the many iterations and paradoxes of the search for immortality online? And I think it's really that today's pursuers of immortality are in a much more desperate quest than the ancient Egyptians. Behind what they're doing, there's really an anxiety. The anxiety that they're part of the last generation before the singularity. It's as though they were casualties in the final hours of the First World War. There is a kind of desperation that they might not live to see the dawning of this age in spite of all of their heroic attempts to achieve it. And I think the remarks of John Gray are really the best way that I would have to sum up on this. And he writes in the Immortalization Commission, "Nothing is more changeable than the self that is preserved in memory. Yet most people yearn for permanence and try to project the person they think they have been or would like to have been into the future. A shadowy double called up from memory, this ghostly self haunts them wherever they go. Longing for everlasting life, humans show that they remain the death-defined animal." Thank you very much.
Just how do they propose to transfer the storage capacity of the human brain into some mechanical device? By what means do they propose to make the transfer, or don't they even consider that?
That's an excellent question. I think...
Of course, I wouldn't have asked you.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's something that they acknowledge that they really don't have the answer. What I think they're saying is that the kind of brain imaging that they have, for example, the ability to reproduce electronically some of the signals in a rat's brain, is an early prototype of what might be scaled up. So you first start with an electronic transfer of very simple functions of another smaller mammal. And then I think they're saying that as computers get more and more powerful, that just as we've been able to sequence DNA, the human genome, much faster than anybody thought, in their way of thinking, the progress of computing will give us the tools to bootstrap our way into greater and greater complexity until we have found a way to automate the transfer of this physiologically and chemically encoded process in the brain to silicon. Now, this is something I am not espousing. This is something I am not supporting. But part of my point here was that these ideas, although they are certainly questioned and the great majority of people may be criticizing them, they are being advanced by people with very responsible positions in major government agencies and corporations. And that gives you an idea of their power. I could have devoted this lecture, if I had read enough into the literature, to summarizing all of the problems that neuroscientists and others have found with this approach. For example, that anything that would really be effective in scanning the brain, in making a map of your brain and the information that's encoded in it, would do so much damage to the brain in the process that it would be useless. That's one of the scenarios, and there are many other objections, and especially you remember at the beginning I was talking about the motivation of Bernal and others in seeing this virtual preservation. It wasn't called virtual yet, but this virtual preservation as a superior, more spiritual form of being human that would replace the old-style biological, emotional, and natural worlds. And that is still a very strong element in post-humanist thought, and Kurzweil and others have talked about some replacement for even physical matter, for the body as a substrate for the mind, and the spreading of this intelligence into the universe. But I think no matter how much somebody paid me to be a spokesman for this point of view, to be an advocate, it would be very hard for me to develop a coherent argument for it. And yet the people who are advancing it are brilliant people. They have done amazing things with technology, and probably that's part of the problem, that they have formed an unrealistic idea of their own abilities, and they really don't see how this goal that they have is really qualitatively very different from everything that's gone on before. Let me just add one other element that I didn't have time for in the lecture, and that is there's a whole branch of mathematics that's devoted to looking at how hard problems are, complexity theory. And this is an important part of mathematics in thinking about the future, because people assume that Moore's law and increasingly powerful computers will eventually solve everything. And what complexity theory says is, no, there are some problems, even ones that appear fairly simple, that are so hard that even if Moore's law would be chugging away for 500 years or 1,000 years, computers would not be powerful enough to solve them. Traveling salesman problem. Many scheduling, fairly simple-looking schedule problems are like that. There's a book in print, I think, by a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study named Avi Wigderson about complexity theory, and I heard him lecture about it. It's actually on the web. I recommend it. In the Princeton University lecture series. He gave a 3-lecture series on complexity theory. One of the fascinating things that he said in that series was that it has been proved that if you solve one of the problems in this class, it is simple to solve them all. However, there are real implications for the internet there, because one of these problems is finding an efficient algorithm for factoring large primes. And large prime numbers are the basis of most of the encryption that is used on the web today for secure sites. So if the millennium were reached and we really were able to solve one of these problems, it would mean that the internet as we know it would collapse. And thus the cloud would collapse with it unless somebody developed some entirely new and unknown principle. So that's one of the paradoxes of the frontiers of technology, that it takes you into a really weird territory that doesn't really show any way out.
As you've alluded to, one way to think about this phenomenon is as part of a larger, a very human quest to think about mortality, about the afterlife, to come to terms with questions that humanists have dealt with as long as there have been humanists. So the question that jumps to my mind is why at this particular historical moment are questions that have traditionally been dealt with by religious thinkers, by poets and artists, seems to get dominated by people coming not just from the sciences, but from a very particular science, which is computer science. So even your brain scientists don't generally think this is realistic. You've suggested probably it's because they've been successful in industry, that these are, at least at the moment, wealthy and powerful people. Do you have another explanation about why, at this particular historical moment, these claims to authority from computer scientists seem to dominate other ways of thinking about this humanist project?
One reason, I think, is that this is so interesting for editors and film producers that even if you believe, and I'm sure that many of them do believe, that it is nonsense. It is very interesting nonsense. It is something that will draw an audience. It certainly drew me. I don't usually pick up copies of Christianity Today, but I bought one to have an original of this issue. So it's possible. It's partly because I find myself drawn to it, and I think that's true of a lot of what goes on in media. Much of what happens is not necessarily based on people's belief that this is really true, that this is really going to happen, but it's based on the fact that it's interesting to look at it and to see where's the catch or how they do it. And that actually goes back to a theme in American culture that reminds me of Neil Harris's book on P.T. Barnum, an excellent book. And Harris there says that the audiences who went to see Barnum were aware that there was a lot of fakery going on. And their goal was really to spot the fakery, to distinguish the real from the false. They saw it as an amusing exercise. And Barnum, for his point, never said there's a sucker born every minute. Barnum had a lot of respect for his audiences. So there was a kind of interplay between the showman entrepreneur and the audience. There were tacit understandings about how much proof you would really ask for, and people enjoyed being on that edge. So you could say that this is, you could another answer to your question is, why do people go to magic shows if the magicians themselves say that it really isn't magic? And a lot of this is quasi-magical thinking.
I think it's a fantastic summary of people trying to achieve immortality through the technology means. And you form any opinions upon those that say there is immortality already. There's a lot of religious traditions that says, your soul does live on.
The article in Christianity that I mentioned does proceed from that premise, and its point also, though, is that in the evangelical Christian scheme of things, it's not enough that your soul be immortal, but you really want your soul to be reunited with God. Your soul otherwise is damned by original sin, and so the Christian way to immortality is to believe in Jesus and the incarnation and the resurrection. But it is an interesting fact about Judaism and Christianity that their texts don't really get that specific as the Egyptians did about what's going to happen in the afterlife. There are all kinds of inferences that Christian writers in particular have made from scriptural passages. There are promises, there are the descriptions of Lazarus and so forth. So it isn't that there's no evidence about the afterlife in the scripture, but for example, there are two notions that are intertwined. One is an immediate judgment right after you die, but there's also the last judgment, as in the Sistine Chapel. So are people going to be yanked out of heaven and hell to be judged and then sent back the way you would have somebody in a courtroom, returned to the jail? I mean, the problem is that the Abrahamic religions really did not feel it was necessary to have that degree of explicit discussion. But that left open, of course, the way for Dante. So it would have been very, very hard for Dante, for an Egyptian Dante, to write a divine comedy, because it was all there in the Book of the Dead. So the West has had this advantage of a kind of ambiguity and some hints about what's going to happen. There is actually quite a literature on the history of Christian ideas of immortality and heaven. And one of the key people there was the 18th century mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, who was also quite a noted engineer and technologist. And I don't know how many people have visited Bryn Athyn and the Bryn Athyn Cathedral. Well, that is really the project of the Pitcairn family, who were involved in many industries and in helicopters, and who are among the leading American followers of Swedenborg. So it's still an active church today, and Swedenborg had visions of heaven and hell that have been very influential, actually, in the popular view, to some extent even among non-Christians, of what happens in heaven. I think he may have been one of the people most responsible for the cloud images of heaven, although I haven't read much into that. But there are books on specifically about thinking about heaven. But the main point I was making there was that this is really in the Western religious traditions. This is a kind of exercise for the faithful. It is not something that is really delivered as it was in the Egyptian writings.
In terms of diffusion of ideas into popular culture, has there been any evidence yet of an impact in industrialized countries on the rates of organ donation? And then secondly, everyone seems to assume that people, these computer scientists mostly, seem to think that immortality is going to it seems to me, if you think about autism as a spectrum, that seems to me to be people becoming more like machines in certain ways. Because if the school bus shows up and it's green, the autistic child becomes irate. It's like a software failure. And I wonder if this explains in part why it's that particular segment of society that is so interested in this transmutation aspect, is that they've already been modified. As science has shown, we all are getting modified by our interaction with machines, with technology. I think perhaps they might be on the vanguard of that in a certain way, and therefore have an even more heightened interest, besides just this sort of usual human longings for, not to be extinct.
Mm-hmm. I'll take your first question. I'm not sure that organ donation is really part of that discourse, probably because the people who believe in revival of the dead or somehow reconstitution of them also believe that it will be possible in the future to regenerate whole organs. So for that kind of advanced thinking, organ donation doesn't really play a part. And for some religious believers, of course, if donating an organ might be considered good works and increase your chances of eternal life, the old-fashioned way. So I'm not sure there's a connection there. But you raise a very interesting point about the personalities of people in some kinds of computer science, and whether this is related to a certain kind of emotional hollowness. And from what I've seen, I can't say that I have been able to observe that in these prominent people. I've been at a conference with William Sims Bainbridge, one that he co-organized. I said hello to him, and I don't think he necessarily liked my review of his book that much. So we didn't chat that much, although it was a favorable review, so I don't know what complaint he has. But anyway, but he's what you would expect in a high NSF official. He has this separated private life, and I think that some of these people actually, in a way, are very emotional people. In fact, they kind of point away from the purely rationalist model. Kurzweil is really very passionately concerned about what happened to his father, and it isn't just that he wants to make himself live forever. He also has a kind of Fyodorovian desire to bring, if maybe talk to his father, maybe somehow revive his father to the extent that there's still a basis for reviving it. So I think that these people really they are probably psychologically different, but I'm not sure whether that difference is on the autistic spectrum, and I think it would take some field work among the transhumanists, like the field work that Bainbridge himself did among the members of the Church of the Process to see what values are driving them. But I don't think it's a function of autism. I think to the contrary, that it's not the kind of thing that an autistic person would really be likely to think about, because it involves all kinds of ways of thinking about the future that I'm not sure that they are likely to do.
Thank you. Given me a lot to puzzle over. When you talk about the people who want the physical immortality, whether by freezing or some chemical means or when the technology can bring it about. And also, you talked about the fellow who wanted to undo the damage. That's, if I imagine myself living forever, it's not this current version of me. Do I decide what I really like to have is the 22-year-old me, 40-year-old me, the 50-year-old me? A blend of the two. My current brain and my 30-year-old life. So I would have to have some other mechanisms in there other than to just arrest my state as it is now and then do the repair or the fixing of the stuff that got ruined by the freezing. So that's one part. So I guess it's tied into the virtual part too, because if I try to immortalize myself by putting a DVD together, or to collect my thoughts, or I have an attempt, so I could do a pretty good job putting together images. What image would I want to present? Not my true me, because I want you to like me. I want you to revere me. And I wouldn't let you see my insecurities. That wouldn't be my agenda.
That's extremely important, and I'm really glad that you brought that that point up in particular, because one of the bases of Facebook is that it's a certain kind of artful presentation of the self, that it isn't the real self, that you really can't afford to put or most people aren't willing to. There probably are a few souls who are really brave enough to do that, but they are not in a position probably to suffer in one way or another from doing that. So that's really a big question. I should say though about what parts. I think the question about what parts of the mind and the body, how to preserve them, are really separate. I think with the mind, the great majority of people who are thinking about this would want all of their memories. They really wouldn't want to wind themselves back the way you can have a restore point with a computer and take it back like that, or work from an old backup. I think they would really want to take all of their experiences to the present, and then to be able to continue to learn and grow. And then if there's something really good in their past, they can certainly go back to it. But I think, except for people who had suffered some unusual traumas, I'm not sure that many people would just want to erase even some of their unpleasant experiences. On the other hand, I think people do have a kind of body ideal, and maybe even physiologically there'd be a way to establish that. And so if people wanted to reconstitute themselves like that, or if this is a service that would be offered by Alcor or a company like that, the default would might be somebody 20, 22 or whatever, and then there'd be some people who'd really want to be teenagers again, and some people who might want to be in their 30s, some people who might want to be older. I mean, I really never considered this, but I think that in that way of thinking, once you believe that is possible, then you are really creating all kinds of menus. But the real problem, though, from Gray's point of view and from mine, though, is that who we are and what we are is conditioned so much by the knowledge of death that a person who is going to be really immortal is like a human being that's living without gravity. It might seem cool to float around, but a lot of science fiction and speculative fiction has been written about how boring it would be to just kind of go on and on without any end, without the kind of narrative of a conventional human life. It gets back to what John Gray said about man being a death-defined animal. That is, we're the only animal that knows that it's going to die. By the way, there was a segment in the Onion that I blogged about an experiment in a primate colony of researchers teaching a chimpanzee that it was going to die. And it's when I posted this, there were some people who thought it was real, and they wrote in to complain about how unethical it was to inflict that knowledge on the poor chimp. But it was signing. I might even. Does this have a live web feed?
Do we? Yeah.
Let me see if I can pull that up now that you brought that up. Oh, it was a gorilla. It was a gorilla. Pardon me. It was a gorilla. And well, let's play. I don't know how to skip this commercial, so it'll be on in a minute. It'll be on in a minute. Okay.
Scientists at Tulane University's Primate Research Center announced they have taught a gorilla that someday it will die. Dick Merritt has more in the lab report.
Thanks, Dan. In an historic first, a team of primatologists has succeeded in teaching quickly a Western lowland gorilla the concept of mortality and its inevitable doom. Leonard Burroughs and Philip Townsend are the researchers leading the project.
When we first started with Lee, he was just a normal, happy game, not a care in the world.
And the first thing we did was we taught him patterns, like red block, blue block, green block, over and over. Then it became a pattern of gorilla born, gorilla grow, gorilla die, over and over.
Right. The researchers then showed Lloyd photographs of dead, dying gorillas while communicating the phrases "you someday" and "no choice."
Finally became cognizant of the correlation between himself and the decomposing pile of air and flesh in the photo.
Quigley shared his feelings in a confessional after completing each exercise.
Sounds good, no number.
Quigley also began pictures like these almost every day. To make sure Quigley retains the awareness of his own demise, the team spends several hours per day reinforcing the certainty of death's arrival.
Quigley, you die. You will die soon.
The researchers said at first Quigley could only communicate rudimentary fears about his own death. But he soon moved on to expressing more complex emotions, like indifference and self-hatred. Philip Townsend and his colleagues even witnessed what they believed to have been a panic attack in Quigley.
He was looking at these English cries and banging his head against the wall. I just thought, who is?
The plant scientists believe that we may be able to teach a gorilla to resort to alcohols. The scientists next plan to test whether the results of Quigley can be replicated with other species. They are in the initial stage of teaching other methods that they will adopt.
Both die.
These are thrilling times. For the lab report, they narrative.
Tanis and Wright are conducting a similar study, teaching a mouse manipulating a graphic to its back.
Okay. Well, so there, but that is. Okay. So, but people did. Some readers of my blog did believe that I was actually giving them a real experiment.
Makes me think of a line that's Heidegger says somewhere that humans die and animals perish. I'm not so sure, but you mentioned David Noble's work, Religion and Technology and the Possibility that there's a religious impulse to some of this kind of thing, and he talks about transcendence and creation and artificial intelligence and the atom bomb and those kinds of technologies. It occurred to me that there were no examples of women involved in some of this work, and whether there might be an anxiety as well, a kind of male anxiety, not just a specifically cultural anxiety. If you have any thoughts about that, one of the things also someone like Mary Shelley's writing, Frankenstein, and so forth. The second question I had is, are there any particularly interesting attempts to theorize some of this philosophically and politically, as opposed to just historicize it? Just one kind of thought is Jacques Derrida, for example, writes about hauntology and specters and ghosts, and the virtual as imbricated always in the real. So, for example, we live increasingly in an age of, I think he calls it telepresences. So there's photographs, there's film, there's archives, there's television that contains already, and in an everyday sense, the kind of living dead. You know, you can watch Charlie Chaplin dance or see your grandparents on a photo. That sort of, the spectral presences are kind of, I guess what one philosopher, Whitehead, calls objective immortality. That we're already in that sort of sphere.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me take the first question on women and transhumanism. And I had been thinking about that myself. I haven't found anything specifically on this. David Noble, as you may know, also wrote a book called World Without Women on the history of science and about the absence of women at various crucial junctures, and about the the kind of male mentalities, especially in the early modern period, that so much of science was the work of these circles of what he calls celibate homosocial males. So there is quite a bit of research about that, and I have there are women who are part of the movement. There is a woman. I'm trying to remember her name, but she is the wife of one of the leading extropians. That's a kind of transhumanist sect, and his name is Max Moore. I'm not sure if he was born with that or he adopted that name. And she has a hyphenated name with Moore in it, and she has a website. So I can think of at least one woman who is prominent in the movement. Whether it is really more male than computer science as a whole or artificial intelligence as a whole, I don't know. There is a definite women's aspect. There are some fields where women have been have really made outstanding contributions in the human interface, and in the MIT has an emotive computing part of their lab. Now, whether that was women who were seeking out what seemed to be the stereotypically more female way of thinking, or whether that was just something that the men had left and that they were filling the vacuum, I don't know. But it's a very respected part of the field. So again, to summarize, I really I think that it is. I see what you mean. That it is a very male way of thinking about posterity and immortality, and you could probably, if you really look through their text, you could probably find something about it, and that's definitely something to do. On the philosophical side, I think you'll find the new book by John Gray that I mentioned that hasn't been. It's been published in England, so if you're in a hurry to see it, I think you can order the British edition, but it will be published here in April, and he is less interested in that. In the aspect that you mentioned of the images, I think what he is most fascinated by is how the efforts to overcome death and to transcend death supported movements like Soviet communism that led to so many people dying in horrible ways, and so that's really a critique that he has of a certain kind of materialist thinking exemplified by, but not limited to 20th century communism.
One more.
Hi. With all these new concepts in sort of virtual immortality and death, what do you think will happen to the spaces of death? Namely, because when we die, we leave physical remains, as well as now with the phenomenon of internet and Facebook and so on, what sort of virtual memory remains. So would this have a profound effect on, say, cemeteries, or will we end up being buried in huge server farms that are owned by Google and so on?
Well, the major urban cemeteries have been running out of space. So the trend has been to build new structures for the interment of ashes. That has been sometimes communal mausoleums, but very often there has been worldwide a growing trend toward cremation, even though in some religious traditions, as in Judaism, it's traditional Judaism, it's prohibited. And Catholicism did change its position on that, and along with cremation, I mean, cremation doesn't necessarily rule out conventional burial, but I think there are not that many people who really want to buy an expensive plot and have a big monument and then just have an urn there. So, but the real constraint there is real estate. There was an article in the New Republic not that long ago about how the latest thing at the time, I think in the 1990s, was for yuppies to buy cemetery plots with great views. And this is in the category of what's called potential consumption, that there are some things like balconies on urban apartment buildings that will add to the price or add to the rent even though you never see anybody actually on them, because it's a contemplation of what you could do if you were out there. And that contemplation takes the part of actual consumption. It's a form of virtual consumption. So you could say that having a cemetery plot with a beautiful view is something that you're really, of course, never going to be able to enjoy once you're there, but it can be worth it for the contemplation, and also that's going to encourage people to visit your grave because they get the bonus of not only being there in the presence of your remains, but having a nice stroll and seeing some scenery, so they'll be more likely to visit there. I'm something of a cemetery buff, and I do try to visit the major cemeteries whenever I'm visiting a city. And one of the things that I've noticed is that in many circles there is a trend toward more lavish and personalized memorials. There are also there are also many regional styles. So, for example, southern monuments, southern gravestones are much more likely to show people as they were in their youth. They have much more naturalistic statuary. They're sometimes very, frankly, sensual statuary. It's very interesting to see that in a Louisville cemetery. So cemeteries are really, they're really great places to think about the living and to watch the living. But I think that apart from the constraints, though, for people who can afford it, there is still a lot of attraction in the idea of having a monument that is there when we don't know how long the web is going to last. We don't know how other things are going to last. But the idea that it's still going to be standing there, people will be seeing it. I mean, the pyramid certainly worked. People have not forgotten those pharaohs. So the logic of it still prevails. That having the physical object there is really maybe the best way to be remembered. And I can think of one example. I guess we're coming toward the end, but one very interesting example worth looking at. There was a citizen of a Greek community in Asia Minor named Diogenes of Enoanda. And Diogenes decided to bestow on the community a book of Epicurean philosophy that he had written, and to have it carved in stone on the central square. And in the course of 2 centuries, all kinds of earthquakes and invasions passed through Turkey, what is now Turkey, then Anatolia. And all of this was totally buried. And then in the later 19th century, a French archaeologist came along, and he started to find fragments of this book-length inscription. And more of them were discovered. There may be still some fragments there. More of them were discovered, and by the early 1990s, there was enough to publish it as a monograph with a translation in English. So as a publishing strategy, that was outstandingly successful. He not only got the attention of generations of scholars, but you can go to any any respectable library of the classics and find Diogenes' work. I think he would be very happy today to know that indirectly people were reading his ideas in that way. So to answer your question, yes, writing in stone may be the ultimate form of inscription still.